Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, folks. How are you doing today? Michael Zuber, one rental at a time, and it is Monday. That means we're talking to our wonderful guest and expert, Mr. Greg Dickerson. How you doing, sir?
Doing great, Michael. How are you today?
I'm doing really, really well. So I was doing some research over the weekend, watching other YouTube channels. Obviously, the concept of real estate crash is a common topic, I guess. But what I like to do on this channel is kind of keep it real. And I want to talk about
clickbait.
Yeah, exactly. But so I want to talk about the last three real estate crashes we've had in the last 100 years, starting with the Great Depression, then the SNL debacle, and then the Great Recession. I want to talk about what happened. Most importantly, what was kind of what happened in the environment so that that can't happen again. And then look forward and talk about what might cause the next housing crash. Is that cool?
Yeah, let's do it.
So let's talk about the Great Depression. Most people watching this likely didn't experience it, maybe have read about it, maybe have a grandparent or whatnot that kind of lived through it. But when I think of the Great Depression and the real estate crash, because it fell 80%, what most people don't appreciate, Greg, I think, is that the lending structure behind the asset of your home was entirely different. My research, having gone through detailed analysis years ago in school, is that the lending structure for houses were 5-year balloons, right? You would have an interest rate, it'd be reasonable, the payment would be next to nothing, but at the end of 5 years, you had to pay it off. And it's obviously very different today. So when you think about Great Depression and the housing crash of that time frame, what do you think? What do you remember? Or yeah, what do you think? Yeah.
It was a very different time. Since the results of that are very different than anything we've seen since. And, I think what the Fed and Treasury have done and are doing now since 2009 moving forward, the argument is if they'd have done some of that, if not all of that back in the Great Depression, we wouldn't have had a Great Depression. So we had a banking crisis. We didn't have jobs. That was the biggest kicker back then, was there were no jobs. Unemployment was just unbelievably high. The financing structures of mortgages were very, very different. Like you said, back then it was largely, banks, local banks, savings and loans that, you and I would put money in the savings and loans, like the old George Bailey Bank, right? And then that went out to do somebody's house, and it was just kind of a revolving door like that. So the money had to be put back in so it could constantly be recycled. So I don't know a whole lot about it, obviously, because it was well before my time. I haven't really studied, something like that. I don't think, based on what I'm seeing and what I've researched these days, could ever happen again.
Yeah. The setup for the Great Depression in real estate was really, it's just a different lending structure. Lending structures were based on balloon payments. You're right, they were very localized, right? Banks would be very kind of town specific. They weren't these big mega banks. So you're absolutely right. So when the other thing that's really a setup of the Great Depression occurred outside of housing, but actually rolled into housing, and that was the stock market, right? The stock market, as I'm sure you've heard, frequently had, leverage ratios of 100, right? 100 to 1. And that's the old joke about the shoe shine boy being a stock market picker. And it worked until it didn't. And then when people had to delever or get a margin called, they had to sell everything, right? They were, to cover the margin call, and that just caused banks to collapse and other things to collapse. So there was unbelievable leverage in a financial system in an environment with I consider 5 years short-term debt, at least in my opinion, right? Because I live in a world of 30-year debt. So all of that, over leverage, bad debt structure, you kind of got what we got. Is that kind of fair?
Yeah. And, an isolated economy. We weren't a global economy at scale like we are now. So, the United States was largely isolated during that whole event. And again, if the Fed would have instituted a QE program back then, like they've done here in the last, 10 years to 12 years, probably wouldn't happen. We probably could have avoided the whole thing altogether. And that was the argument for everybody stepping in, the government stepping in 2008 and 9, because if they hadn't, well, then you probably could have seen a global depression. It would have
Yeah.
taken down the financial system globally.
Yeah, for sure. So again, when I think about the Great Depression and why that setup won't happen again, the debt structure is different now. 30-year fixed is the dominant mortgage. You have a bigger financial system. It's not local banks where if you get a bank run, it kind of all explodes. You do have a lot less leverage in the stock market. It's no longer 100 to 1. It might be 10 to 1. So the setup from a Great Depression kind of occurring again, it's that setup, that unique environment, not really couldn't happen again, in my opinion. We could have a crash.
Yeah, nothing's impossible, but
Right.
the central banks and governments around the world, as we saw in 2008 and 9, are not going to let that.
Yeah. So now let's go to what's often called the savings and loan crisis. That is an environment. I was a teenager, I believe, in that environment. So I remember hearing about it, but after doing a lot of research on it, there was actually something that occurred in the tax code that really caused a wave of selling. And what I remember from that environment was there was a lot of rich or well-to-do folks that were buying investment real estate to have losses because their losses at the time would go against ordinary income. So real estate investing became a form of tax shelter for doctors and dentists and lawyers and the folks that were well-to-do in that environment. And when the government took that away and limited losses against ordinary income, the value of those assets fell off a cliff, and the people lending in that environment, which were really savings and loans, couldn't get out of the way. Is that kind of a fair summary?
Yeah, it was a banking crisis. The Great Depression was, at the end of the day, you had the run on the bank. So that was a banking crisis in a literal sense where people were pulling their money out of banks. The stock market was crashing. The savings and loan crisis was a banking failure of savings and loans, where the federal government had to step in and start taking them over because they were failing. And again, it was similar to the 2009 in the sense of easy credit. So that was a lot of what happened. There were overvalued assets, easy credit, overly speculative investments like you're talking about that went bad. So that was the root of the savings and loan crisis. And then, 2008-9, we obviously didn't learn our lessons from then because it happened all over again. Very different world of easy credit, but very similar in terms of the speculative behavior that we saw in the savings and loan crisis.
Yeah, when I look at the savings and loan, I see it. I see what you see, but I see it being very different, right? Basically, what I see is the rules of the game changed, right? There were a set of individuals that were operating under one set of tax rules. You can argue whether they were right or wrong. I don't make that argument. They could have been horrible, but that's where they were the rules. And thus they overpaid. Like you said, they got speculative. They built up assets to, frankly, stupid levels. And then when the rules of the game changed, those assets were suddenly worth a lot less. And they were like, nope, don't want this. Give it back to the bank. Then you had, the savings and loans who had dominated that lending structure. They just couldn't get out of the way. And there are a lot of similarities. But I think the thing that pricked the bubble was a tax change or the rules of the road changed.
Yeah, interesting. I haven't really studied that at scale either because I was younger. I wasn't in the business at that time. I don't even know what time frame was that.
I think it was 83 to 85.
Yeah, so I was in the military, traveling the world, excuse me, and I didn't even own any real estate at that point.
Yeah, it's something I've definitely gone back and looked at it, and really what it was in context again is the well-to-do. Again, it's everything I've always read talked about doctors and dentists, and I'm sure lawyers and others were involved, but basically
builders too, because a lot of my friend area during that time period, they said it was they said, business it shut off like a faucet. The real estate market tanked overnight. It was like somebody helping investing experienced what we all experienced in 2009 when the same thing happened, because they would caution me because I was very bullish. In my early career, I was just young, dumb. I hadn't studied any of that, didn't think anything like that could happen, didn't think anything would change. And, I was just opportunistic and as optimistic as possible. And going into 2008 and 9, I had a rude awakening.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, I think, again, the Great Depression, there was a bad loan structures, right? 5-year terms. Now they're 30 years. What we saw are tax changes, which, oh, by the way, we have to pay attention to in 2020 and 2021. There's talk of 1031, there's talk of depreciation, all this other stuff around us. So realize, just like the S&L crisis, if there's meaningful tax changes to how real estate investing is treated, it could have a surprise negative impact, just like the S&L crisis. So now let's go to the one that we both experienced, the Great Recession. The Great Recession, in my opinion, kind of the setup was real estate could only go through the roof. Banks, or actually I'll start with Wall Street. Wall Street realized that they could create CD, or basically loan packages or bonds out of thousands of homes, and they can build tranches, CDOs, and all of that, a la The Big Short. And then banks got aggressive, and then speculators got stupid, and it was just a toxic soup of over leverage and bad debt and lots of things that ultimately had to explode. What do you think?
Yeah. Lead into this, but you're really fuzzy too. So I don't know what's going on. But anyways, yeah, I mean, it was the subprime lending that created that bubble, and it was the rehypothecation of all of those mortgage-backed securities, and that were levered up over and over and over, where the whole system was levered up probably 1,000 to 1 at the end of the day. That was a huge, it was a banking crisis. It was a subprime lending crisis. And it was leveraging the system systemically throughout the world. It was a global thing, way different than anything we'd experienced before, because of the way that it was rehypothecated and leveraged up through those derivatives.
Yeah, the whole system there for a couple of years got wacky. It was greed upon greed upon greed. And really it had to pop, because that appreciation that last couple of years was all fake. And really what exploded in my research is, we were doing about 50% adjustable rate mortgages, which is kind of funny when you think back to the Great Depression. What did we talk about? Well, it was the debt structure, and we had debt structure that you had to refinance or pay off. And the thinking in 2004, 5, and 6 was, don't worry, housing goes up, you'll just refi to a lower rate. It has a lot of similarities to the Great Depression. And that's the beauty of today, is like 98% of mortgages are fixed rate, 30-year term.
Yeah, it's all about keeps the world going round.
Yeah. Yeah, so I don't see the setup today like the Great Depression. Like, I don't see any tax changes right now like the S&L crisis. I don't see bad lending like we saw in the Great Recession. Like, lending is hard today for folks. You got to have good debt to income. You have to have good credit, all of those things. So I don't see anything set up that would be like the last 3 housing crashes. We are certainly in a housing slowdown, but a slowdown is not a crash. Any kind of closing thoughts on this topic?
No, I guess we're going to talk about that topic here in a credit, if anything, is tightening.
Yes, I agree. Credit is
so that is your risk right now. And of course,
go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. And of course, we're not through the pandemic yet. So that's another risk right there. So, but we'll talk about interest rates and where all that could lead here in the next episode, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Folks, a couple of quick things. First and foremost, if you've been watching my channel for any length of time, I have AT&T, and it sucks. Today at 1 o'clock, we are bringing Comcast into the house and seeing if their internet is any better. So we shall see. We're paying for that. We're paying for the most and the best, and it's not working out. So we'll see what happens when we change it.
Today's been really bad. It's freezing up a lot. I don't know what's going on.
Yeah, we'll get through it. We'll do what we can. But at 1 o'clock
Delta,
today,
man, Delta's got your internet.
That, and we have a housing guest. So now we have 3 people on it.
That sucker is serious, man.
Thank you, buddy.